Welcome, everybody. I'm Chris Popolo at Doubleday. I'm here to introduce Bob Kolker, author of Hidden Valley Road. Hidden Valley Road is the story of the Galvins, a picture-perfect, mid-century American family with 12 talented children, 6 of whom spiraled into violence and confusion and were diagnosed with schizophrenia. The other 6 watched on in horror, with no way of knowing if they would be next. In this extraordinary book, Robert Kolker has crafted a riveting family drama and a captivating medical mystery. The Galvins' fate unfolds over decades, alongside the story of how science has struggled to understand and treat severe mental illness. The Galvin story is frankly terrifying, but what is remarkable about this book is the compassion with which it's told. Bob Kolker's characterizations of the family members are masterful. Each mentally ill brother is wholly individual, with remarkably different expressions of the same disease. The 2 sisters are indelible characters, best friends, both victimized by their brothers, who make sharply different choices about how to cope. And Mimi Galvin is a mother out of Tennessee Williams. Once she accepts the truth about her 6 sons, she becomes their fiercest protector, often at the expense of the other children. Every living Galvin, sick and well, cooperated with Bob to tell this rich and complex story, giving the book incredible intimacy and depth. When I think of books to compare it to, I automatically go to memoirs of exceptional childhoods, like The Glass Castle or Educated, and it has that memoir-level immediacy and feeling. The other book I think of is Rebecca Skloot's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Because of the unusual amount of mental illness in the Galvin family, scientists became convinced that clues to the workings of the disease might lie in their genome. As Bob reveals over the twisting course of the book, they were right. In the Galvins' tragedy may lie the hopes of eradicating schizophrenia in future generations. Robert Kolker is the author of one other book, Lost Girls, chosen as a New York Times notable book and a Publishers Weekly Top 10 book of 2013. That book, which explored the unsolved murders of prostitutes on Long Island, was another story that required families to place enormous faith in Bob. That is his special gift, I feel, to fully humanize the people society does not always value: the desperate, the addicted, and in this book, the mentally ill and their families. I feel enormously fortunate to have won this book in a hard-fought auction, and already the praise is pouring in, with blurbs from David Gran, Susanna Callahan, Andrew Solomon, Sylvia Nassar, and more. I have the highest hopes for masses of readers when we publish next spring, and I'm pleased that you will be among the very first. And now I give you Robert Kolker.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Chris. That was very flattering. I'm very glad to be speaking here today before you all. When I think about libraries, I think about my high school's library, which was unusual in the nicest of ways. My high school, which was in the Maryland suburbs, was built in the 1970s, and I think the architect must have been influenced by 2001: A Space Odyssey, because the school was built like a big bicycle wheel or a donut, or a toilet bowl, as we like to say. And the library was the hole in the middle of the donut. And the classrooms were all part of the exterior part of the donut, and every time you exited a classroom, you were staring straight at the school library, and for this reason, the library became the main hangout space of the school. It's where you met your friends, where your clubs met, and it's where you researched your papers, of course. And it really was the heart of the place. And even before high school, I loved writing, but I really discovered reporting and journalism in my 20s when I was a reporter for a little community weekly on the west side of Manhattan. While others got into journalism to cover the White House or to become a foreign correspondent, I really connected with reporting on everyday people. Every week we returned to the same people dealing with the same situations, whether they were fighting a new skyscraper or dealing with a crime problem on their street. It was a little bit of a soap opera. It had a narrative aspect to it, and I found that I was comfortable walking in the shoes of certain people week after week after week. And I became fascinated by nonfiction storytelling, or narrative nonfiction, or new journalism, or long-form journalism, whatever you want to call it. And my career really took shape at New York Magazine, where I spent several years writing feature stories and cover stories. And while I was there, I was drawn to stories that required intense research and reporting on complicated issues, but at the end of the day, they focused on the interior lives of ordinary people. I discovered authors I wanted to emulate, like Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc and Alex Kotlowitz and Catherine Boo. These writers are narrative geniuses. They're trying to show more than tell, but mostly through exhaustive reporting, they are able to lift a veil on a part of society that we would otherwise never see. And most important of all, recognize the humanity in people we might never have considered are really quite like us. My first book, Lost Girls, about an unsolved series of killings in Long Island, was a murder mystery, but it also was a social issues book about 5 of the victims and their lives. And in the end, it was about their families, 5 different families with different levels of strife and estrangement and bonds. And now with Hidden Valley Road, I've happened upon a way to explore that subject more deeply than I ever dreamed I'd be able to. In the spring of 2016, a friend introduced me to 2 sisters, Margaret Galvin Johnson and Lindsay Galvin Rauch. Now they're both in their 50s. They were the youngest siblings and the only girls in a family with 12 children. Of their 10 older brothers, 6 of them had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. The more I learned about the Galvin family, the more I couldn't believe their story. It was horrifying. The oldest brother, Donald, tried to kill his wife before being sent to a state mental hospital more than 20 times over 2 decades. The 7th son, Joe, sent threatening letters to the president. The 9th son, Matt, believed that he was Paul McCartney. The 10th son, Peter, once shattered the windows of the house right in front of his parents. The 4th son, Brian, shot his girlfriend and turned the gun on himself in a murder-suicide that shook the family. And perhaps most appallingly, as the sisters told me, the 2nd son, Jim, sexually abused them both from the time that they both were very young. All this in just one family, and I couldn't imagine it, and I wondered how such a family could even pretend to stay together under such horrible circumstances. Why these sisters wouldn't have run away the first chance they got, never to come back. But these 2 sisters, when I spoke with them, showed that they still had a reservoir of hope. They told me how each of them found a way through their traumatic childhoods in different ways, and they told me that their family has a scientific legacy, that they were so statistically unusual that they became one of the first families to be studied by the National Institute of Mental Health as part of the search for the genetic origins of schizophrenia. And later on, when I talked with several of the researchers who have analyzed the family's genetic material, I learned that samples of their DNA helped form the cornerstone of genetic research into schizophrenia that continues today. I started to learn things that even the family hadn't been told until they asked me to work on this book. The sisters wanted their family story told as a work of independent journalism. They believed everybody in their family, sick and well, would participate. And I have to admit, I was really skeptical. I'm a reporter, and I know the medical privacy laws and in this country, and no one has to be told how sensitive a subject mental illness can be, how those of us who have it in our lives or in our families often find it too painful to discuss with other people. Even more than autism or bipolar disorder or depression or Alzheimer's, it seems to me anyway, that schizophrenia is something that people have difficulty looking at directly or discussing explicitly if it affects them. But this family was ready. Every single surviving Galvin family member was interviewed for this book. Now, I can think of many wonderful and moving personal memoirs about mental illness, and I can think of many eye-opening books about the science of mental illness. But to my knowledge, Hidden Valley Road is unique in that no nonfiction author has ever really tried to write a 360-degree, full-scale narrative about every single family member with all their points of view. So it was a heavy lift. I ended up structuring the book as a family saga with science woven in. I start with the parents, Don and Mimi Galvin, marrying during World War II, moving to Colorado and raising their family. It was not lost on me that the dozen children of the Galvin family perfectly spanned the baby boom. Donald, the oldest, was born in 1945, and Lindsay in 1965. Their century was the American century, filled with optimism, at least in the early years. You start to see some warning signs that something is amiss, but the parents have no preparation for what happens to them next. The kids first start to have their psychotic breaks in the late 60s, and I have to admit that while I was reporting, I thought a lot about American Pastoral, Philip Roth's story of a family of this same generation that believed in the American dream and felt confident and invulnerable until that family fell to pieces. The decisions the Galvin parents made when all was well and all is not so well, they become reevaluated by the children later on. The 6 mentally ill brothers each suffer differently. In discussing their illnesses, I also weave in a sort of shadow history of the evolving science of mental illness in the 20th century. This is not really a pretty story. It's about barbaric treatments like lobotomy, and about researchers working in silos and not listening to one another, about clashing theories of the illness, slowing progress, about groupthink, stymieing innovation. In Hidden Valley Road, I cover a lot of ground, from early cases studied by Freud and Jung to the mother blaming in the 1950s and the anti-psychiatry movement of the 60s and 70s, and finally now the focus on genetics. And there are some actual encouraging potential breakthroughs in research related to this family, conducted by researchers who first met the family back in the 1980s. This scientific story is meant to work in service to the story of the family. I write about how the children who did not become mentally ill were in many respects as affected as their brothers. They sometimes felt as if they were carrying an unstable element inside of them. They wondered how soon it would be until they too became mentally ill. Each of these siblings searches for ways to cope, and we learn about them all. But through it all, the two sisters, Lindsay and Margaret, are our mainstays. By holding on to Lindsay and Margaret, we have that center to guide and sustain us, and we learn about their relationship to one another and their very different ways of processing everything that has happened to them. They need each other, but they clash too, and through it all, the reader is given several different ways of looking at the same family, and that, I believe, is something we all can relate to. I know my feelings and memories about my family are not identical to those of my sister or those of my brother. We all carry our own sort of truths and narratives with us, stories we tell ourselves to keep on going or to make sense of the past or to justify decisions we make. And Hidden Valley Road is a chance to see how one family under extreme pressure processes their memories in order to go on, to survive. As I got to know the Galvins better, I came away thinking that Hidden Valley Road was a chance to tell a story not just of survival and resilience, but of redemption and even hope. It's not just about how one family's dreams are shattered. It's about children, now grown, investigating the mysteries of their own childhood, reevaluating the lives of their parents, rediscovering the humanity in their own suffering brothers. And it's about, even after the worst has happened in virtually every imaginable way, finding a new way to understand what it means to be a family. Thank you.